Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Impact webinar, Building a Wind Powerhouse, Australia's path from local strategies to global impact. I'm Kayla, content analyst at Leader Associates, and it's my great honor to be a host for today's webinar. Australia is at a pivotal moment in its renewable energy transition, with wind power playing an important role. From tapping into the strong steady winds of regions like Victoria and Western Australia to planning ambitious projects, the country is paving the way for a cleaner, more sustainable energy future. Yet, with such vast potential comes a pressing challenge. How can Australia secure its position as a global leader in wind energy? This webinar will focus on the key role of Australian government leadership, coordination with local communities, and the contributions of international developers. There are leaders from the Parliament of Australia, Western Australia Department of Energy, Mines, Industry Regulation and Safety, Victoria Department of Jobs, Skills, Industry and Regions, RWE, and OX2 as they explore the key drivers behind the expansion of Australia's wind energy sector. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to share your insights via the chat box. This webinar also marks the global launch of Australia Wind Energy 2025, the country's largest onshore and offshore wind energy event, where you can meet the entire wind energy value chain, taking place on July 17th to 18th, 2025. It aims to foster local, national, and international cooperation and help deliver a new energy economy. Now, let's begin today's session. We have a special pre-recorded message from Dr. Jess Walsh, Senator for Victoria in the Parliament of Australia. Dr. Walsh has been a passionate advocate for renewable energy, and in her message, she will share her thoughts on Victoria's leadership in offshore wind energy and the local initiatives with global relevance. Let's now welcome.
Hi everyone, I'm joining you today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past and present, and I acknowledge too the Gunai-Kurnai people who are the traditional owners of the land and sea country in Gippsland. And I'll be in Gippsland today for an important forum about our offshore wind industry, and that's why I can't join you live today, but this Impact webinar in partnership with Wind Energy 2025 is a really great thing. Because I can tell you a little bit about today's forum with the Committee for Gippsland and Assistant Minister for a Future Made in Australia, Senator Tim Ayres. We'll be joined by offshore wind developers, local manufacturers, unions, higher education, First Nations and community to partner together to maximise the opportunities for local businesses and local jobs in the energy transformation that's underway. Now, you've heard the Prime Minister talk a lot about a future made in Australia, and we want to see a future made in Gippsland too, as we build this new offshore wind industry from the ground and sea up. Gippsland, of course, is home to Australia's first declared offshore wind zone, and it's also brown coal country, coal that has powered our state for generations and to this day. With Victoria's ambitious renewables targets, our Victorian Minister, Lily D'Ambrosio, has worked really hard to bring offshore wind to our state. And my colleague, our Federal Minister, Chris Bowen, has now awarded the first tranche of feasibility licences to 10 developers as part of our own national targets. And we are all systems go to embrace this huge opportunity. The key insight I want to share with you today is that for our government, offshore wind is not only about generating our future electricity from Gippsland, it's about generating opportunity for Gippsland too. Opportunities like a secure future for coal worker Russell, who I recently met at Yallourn, which is set to close in 2028. And at just 32, Russell told me he's looking for a future in power generation, and we want to deliver that future with offshore wind. And so too do developers like Star of the South. Star of the South partnered with Energy Australia, Federation Uni and TAFE Gippsland to detail the pathways from being a fitter and turner like Russell to a turbine or hydraulics technician in offshore wind. And we want to help build those pathways. And to help pave the way, our legislated Net Zero Economy Authority is now up and running, with a focus on Gippsland and 4 other regions across the nation that are set to transform too. We're also working to deliver opportunities for local businesses and workers in the offshore wind supply chain, from steel fabrication businesses making the components of our towers to undersea cable manufacturers and more. We want to see a future made in Australia in regions just like Gippsland and actively generate local jobs as part of the renewable transition. And that's why our Assistant Minister Tim Ayres is in the region with me today, and he will have more to say about just how we're going to work to get that done. Opportunity for First Nations communities is also really core to the energy transformation for our government. In Gippsland, the Gunai Kurnai Land and Water Corporation are building partnerships with developers, partnerships that are really important to us. Minister Bowen speaks really often about his commitment to work with First Nation communities to build engagement, equity, ownership and community wealth through the energy transformation, a commitment that is shared across our government. So today, while I'm off to Gippsland to talk about the opportunities of the offshore wind transformation there, I hope I've given you some insight into our government's commitment to help build an industry from the ground and see up, an industry that delivers renewable energy generation and opportunity for future generations in our regions too. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh, for sharing these inspiring remarks. Gippsland's pioneer role in leading the offshore wind energy industry highlights the importance of local efforts in driving both national and global progress. Our next keynote will be delivered by Wenona Hadingham, Director of Planning and Coordination for Energy Policy Western Australia at the Department of Energy Mines, Industrial Regulation and Safety. Wenona will present on Western Australia wind energy outlook and policy, lessons and future directions. Wenona, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Senator Walsh. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you from today in Western Australia. I acknowledge the continuing connection of traditional owners to the lands and country in Western Australia and throughout Australia, and also pay my respects to elders past and present. Today I'm going to be chatting to you about energy transition in Western Australia. So I would like to start by giving a bit more context about Western Australia and the energy systems here. So we aren't part of the national electricity market, and we have three distinct energy systems in WA. So we have the Southwest Interconnected System, the state's main grid, with over 1 million customers and 36% renewable energy in the last financial year. Then we have the Northwest Interconnected System, which is kind of a loosely connected group of networks, but the development of this transmission system will be really kind of key to achieving decarbonisation in that region. And I'll talk about the Pilbara a little bit later. Western Australia is also unique in that it has a number of off-grid and horizon power microgrids. Okay, and now wind quality in WA is spectacular. So we have wind both in the south area from so north of Perth and south of Perth, and then we have wind in the area around the middle of the state, and then also pockets of wind in the Pilbara. So the wind profiles are also different, which really provides an amazing opportunity in Western Australia to get a high percentage of renewable energy through this excellent and diverse wind resource. So if we turn first to the Southwest Interconnected System, the state's main grid, we've got 36% renewables at the moment. We also have coal and gas, and we have increasing demand. So we have coal that's looking to retire, demand growth, and a desire to connect more renewable energy. So if we link that together, what does that mean in terms of what the forecast looks like for the future? So we've got our own process in WA. We've got a capacity mechanism which looks to look ahead and then seeks to deliver that capacity to meet the needs of the grid. So we can see that we've got processes that have meant that capacity has been filled for 26, 27, but we have gaps going forward after that. So the line going down reflects coal retirements, and the line going up reflects demand increasing over time. So that gap reflects a really big opportunity for renewable energy generation, like wind generation, firmed by storage and gas. Wind generation will no doubt be a feature of the energy transition in WA. There's a number of different forecasts that have been done. Western Australia, with its high industrial base, if that chooses to electrify, and if we have some green export activities, forecasts are that demand could be as high as 13.8 gigawatts in that grid, which would need around 50 gigawatts of renewable generation to meet that demand. That's a 2042 forecast. Even under the most conservative forecast, we will need significant growth in renewable generation to meet demand. So the way to do that is to connect those diverse resources through new transmission. Here are transmission lines that are being planned, scoped and planned at the moment. The one in black, the Clean Energy Link North, is committed, and the others are under planning and development. You will also see a line from Kalgoorlie North. I mentioned earlier the off-grid sector. The off-grid sector has a number of entities that are in the safeguard mechanism. So they have solid commitments that they must meet by 2030. This offers a really good opportunity to build more transmission for entities to connect to, for projects to connect to a grid, and to share in renewable energy resources through common user infrastructure. So that's an exciting project that we're just getting underway with at the moment as well. In terms of the market arrangements, the market settings that we have in place, and we are reforming and changing over time to make sure they reflect the fact that wind is going to play a major role in our electricity system. It's gone from a minor role, it's currently 16%, and it's going to play a much bigger role. So we have a reserve capacity mechanism because we are a small isolated grid, and that means that capacity is procured to meet expected demand plus a reserve margin. We have the relevant level method to use to contribute the renewable resources to meet this demand, and then that is reflected in the awarding of capacity credits. We're updating this method. A new relevant level method is being introduced that's going to assess the load carrying capability of the fleet of intermittent generators. So this is going to be divided up between the intermittent generators based on their performance during high demand intervals. So it's really a fit for purpose methodology that's going to support the transition of our energy system to a high renewable one over time, as well as changes to increase the amount of renewables in the grid. We're also updating market settings to support that, the firming side of it, and the system strength side. So we had new WEM commencing in 2023. A flexible capacity product is going to be introduced to the reserve capacity mechanism so that it can address the needs of the system. We are consulting on a 10-year price guarantee for firming renewable technologies to provide more investor confidence. And we are also, through the Power System Security and Reliability Review, looking at those connection standards that apply to the new facilities, make sure that the network remains secure. As well as opportunities for onshore wind, there is a final declared area was announced in August 2024, and feasibility license applications are open. The application period closes on the 3rd of December. We expect that these licenses will be awarded in 2025. The area is kind of south of Perth. and it could support significant generation capacity. So given the challenges and the scale of what's needed, the Western Australian government has set up a new entity, Powering WA, to help transform and decarbonise the energy system. So that is starting with the main grid, so the Swiss, and also looking at the goldfields. Its roles include coordinating the build out of transmission, working across government, and also making sure we give the right consideration to social performance, environment, culture. So making sure that we can manage the pace and the complexity of this energy transition. Now, turning to the Pilbara, many of you will know that the Pilbara is like a globally significant economic region. It's got 32% of our national export revenue, with most of that coming from iron ore and LNG, 78% of WA's export revenue. Also is quite emissions intensive. It accounts for 40% of WA's emissions. And so there's a massive opportunity here with the current loosely connected system of transmission networks to interconnect and share resources as we decarbonise. And that's particularly the case when you've got wind, and you'll see in this next graph, wind is not ubiquitous. So wind, the main mining area is in the middle here, and then the wind is around the edges. So really being able to reach and share that wind resource will be critical to supporting the switch, so fuel switching from gas to renewables, as well as the electrification of these major projects. We've got the potential for this, for electrification and decarbonisation of the mining sector, but there's also the potential for the development of strategic industrial areas, which would add significantly to demand in the region. So we've got a real opportunity in the Pilbara, and then to harness that opportunity, the WA government has been, and Energy Policy WA has been leading the Pilbara Energy Transition Plan. So we've been planning for a common user transmission network for the Pilbara's future electricity system. We have been doing that with industry, so building the case for common user infrastructure, working with traditional owners. As Senator Walsh mentioned, in Victoria, it's also a very key element of the work that we're undertaking in Western Australia, is working very closely with traditional owners. And we have a Pilbara roundtable that is inclusive of both industry, traditional owners, and community more broadly in the Pilbara. So this process has identified 4 priority corridors, and expressions of interest have been put to the market for private sector interest in building these transmission networks in these corridors to support the decarbonisation of the region. We are working with through that process, and it promises to be a really exciting development for the region. I've listed here, and I understand the slides will be available to everyone, the Pilbara Energy Transition Plan, if people would like more information on that. So the first step is getting the transmission in place, and then beyond that, there will be opportunities for the development of renewable energy projects to connect to that transmission. And this next slide gives just a very high level overview of how we think that this build out will happen in the context of a mining area. So we have industry seeking access from solar near existing operations where that's possible. Sometimes there are areas that are labelled for future mining, so it's not appropriate to put solar resources on those areas. And then we will have from 2027 miners seeking to access high quality wind to complement the solar to reach targets. Beyond 2030, we will have renewable energy in the coastal industrial areas to support those green export industries. And then once we've got transmission to the high quality wind, more solar can also be developed at those hubs as well. And then storage is added to firm that renewable energy alongside of the existing gas. So that's kind of how it looks on a page, that Pilbara area. And that's just really a very quick snapshot of the role that wind will likely play across WA. It's going to be a key resource. And just to kind of highlight some of the key messages for WA's energy transition, it's progressing really quickly. We will possibly be the first state to retire all coal. That's going to be very complex, and that's going to mean the need for connection to renewable energy very quickly. So investments in renewable generation and network upgrades are a priority. And this is going to involve industry and government working closely together, which is kind of part of the establishment of Powering WA, so that we can continue that close working relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Wenona, for this insightful presentation and your comprehensive overview of the policy framework and the wind energy outlook in Western Australia was both informative and thought-provoking. Thank you. And here we have got some questions for you. First, as we look towards the future, what actionable opportunities exist for international investors and developers looking to enter the Australian market?
Thanks, Kayla. There are a number of opportunities, I guess, in both in the near term, assisting with the decarbonisation of the Southwest Interconnected System. There's opportunities for wind projects to connect to new infrastructure in the Swiss. There's also likely to need new projects for mining projects that are looking to decarbonise through connection of renewable energy. There's a number that have added hybrid energy systems to their projects to support their decarbonisation. And in the medium and longer term, there'll be opportunities for new wind generation in the Pilbara, and then there'll be also opportunities potentially in the Goldfields region if we get some common user infrastructure there. And then it just really depends on the size of future demand onto the size of those opportunities.
Thank you for sharing. And moving from opportunities to practical implementation, could you elaborate on how the WA government is streamlining process for wind developers to ensure a smooth path to development and sustainable growth in the region?
Sure, Kayla. So as I mentioned, Powering WA has been set up. That's one example of dealing with the pace and the complexity of change that we need, and setting up that Pilbara energy transition plan, getting a team really focused on delivering that quickly has been kind of one of the ways government's been supporting that. Western Power's also been working very closely with industry in the Southwest and categorising projects to support those ones that are ready to move forward. The other initiative that's probably worth mentioning here is a green approvals approach, where there has been, and like other jurisdictions, a real focus on getting approvals, case management for green energy approvals to ensure that they can happen quickly.
Thank you once again, Wenona, for your detailed answers. And it's clear that Western Australia is making significant strides in creating environmental conducive to sustainable wind energy growth. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, and now let's turn our attention to the role of regional development in driving wind energy. Please welcome Sara Rhodes-Ward, Regional Director of Gippsland at Victoria Department of Jobs, Skills, Industry and Regions, who will present on unlocking the power of regional development in driving the energy transition. Let's welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Fine.
Fantastic. I'm happy to commence my presentation if that's all right. Are you able to confirm that you can see that slide?
Yeah, I can see your slides clearly. Please go on.
Wonderful. Fabulous. Thank you so much. So as Kayla has introduced, I'm Sara Rhodes-Ward from Regional Development Victoria as part of the Department of Job Skills, Industry and Regions. I've got the opportunity to talk to you about regional development in driving the energy transition using our current energy journey as part of the illustration for this discussion this afternoon. For those of you who aren't familiar with Gippsland, I thought it might be useful just to take a quick journey through our energy transition so that we're able to understand the context within which our energy experience is occurring. So currently, Gippsland has 3 coal-fired power stations. The Yallourn Power Station, which has announced its closure in 2028, the Loy Yang A Power Station, which has announced its closure in 2035, and the Loy Yang B Power Station, which is yet to formally announce a closure date. Our experience with energy transition to date has been one of participating, I guess, as observers almost in the Hazelwood transition, with the Hazelwood Power Station closing in March 2017. This closure came following an incident, the Hazelwood mine fire, and was ultimately a decision by the owners of that station to cease operating. Part of the experience of the community was that 5 months' notice was provided prior to that closure, which was a challenging timeframe for the community to both understand what closure would mean, but also for organisations to provide a system of support, not only for workers that were in that space, both directly employed workers and also contractors, but also the regional economy that very much sat around the operation of the Hazelwood Power Station. So that experience gave rise to the government then choosing to negotiate with power stations around closure dates and to require them to give greater notice to community of those closures so that we are able to work with communities, work with business and industry to ensure that we have plans and structured arrangements around those closures to support workers and those communities. So that is the context of our energy journey in the Latrobe Valley, which is part of Gippsland. And then also we have declining oil and gas reserves off the coast of Gippsland. So for many years, Gippsland has been both a brown coal-fired power generator, but also an oil and gas resource for the state. If I move now to what we see as the energy transition, so Gippsland has now been, was announced as the Australian government's first declared offshore wind zone. And there are a number of capacity statements that have been made in relation to this area off the coast of Gippsland. And you'll see it is quite an extensive area, so 15,000 square kilometres with the potential power generation of 25 gigawatts. We see 15,000 jobs during construction and potential for 7,500 ongoing jobs. At this stage, the initial investment figures are around the $59 billion phase as we look to scale up and develop what will be Australia's first offshore wind generation area. At the moment, the federal government has released a range of feasibility licenses. There are 12 licenses for the area that you can see there on the screen, and those licenses have been issued to 10 proponents. So a very strong take-up of the opportunity to develop business cases to support the creation or the development of an offshore wind industry for Gippsland. And you can see there at the bottom of that slide, they are the offshore wind generation capacity targets set by the Victorian government. So 2 gigawatts in 2035, and then you can see the remaining targets. In relation to wind energy, particularly offshore wind energy for Gippsland, we have both experienced and enjoyed reasonably strong support from a broad range of stakeholders throughout Gippsland, but that has occurred with quite a lot of work in terms of both sharing information and understanding and supporting community and business to understand what the opportunities may be through the energy transition and the development of offshore wind. If I move on to my next slide here, the advice that we often give, because we do provide support to not only offshore wind proponents, but a range of other energy providers or energy projects looking to Gippsland. Gippsland has a range of natural attributes that make it a relatively good place for the development of the energy industry. Obviously, we have an existing infrastructure, transmission infrastructure assets, which had been servicing our coal-fired power generators. And so for our region, a large amount of that infrastructure is already in place, and we realise that that is a particularly unique asset. We also have a large workforce which has experience with power generation and power distribution. And we also appreciate that that is a unique aspect for our community compared to other communities where energy may not be an existing part of their economic framework. When we talk about energy transition in place, these are some really important messages that we talk about. That energy transition in regional communities, recognising that Gippsland is a part of regional Victoria, the transition will always be hyperlocal. And what do we mean when we say hyperlocal? People have a strong expectation that projects and proponents coming into the region will have a strong understanding of place and a strong understanding of the experience of place. Now, Gippsland has a very long history of energy generation, very long history of energy transition and industry transition, moving right back from privatisation. It has a large history with emergency events, and there's an expectation that when these projects come to our community, they have a sense of understanding. But grounded at the very foundation of all of that is an expectation that energy projects, particularly renewable energy projects, will respect the history of place. And so we often talk to project proponents who are interested in talking to not only business and industry, but the community about their energy project. And it might be a renewable energy project, and they want to, talk with great enthusiasm and positivity around a renewable energy project. But at times we'll make the mistake of talking about our energy past in less than glowing terms. And so we often hear the language of the dirty energy of the past or the dirty brown coal-fired power stations. And I think what's really important when you are talking about energy projects in a community that has provided 90 years of energy generation for the state, to understand that for that community, they've had enormous pride in filling that role, and they have created and generated for themselves history and tradition that they're incredibly connected to. And so in terms of being able to talk about energy transition, it's important to always start from the place of respecting history, respecting the work of experience, and just holding space to acknowledge that the people engaged in that work have done so through an earnest desire to support not only their community and their region, but Victoria more broadly. We also talk about the fact that energy transition is incredibly exciting, and we do see incredible opportunities for Gippsland in the energy transition. But we also recognise that there is an emotion of loss that occurs. And so that will be loss around the traditional way that things have been done. And so there's a sensitivity that needs to occur and some patience in place that is context sensitive, where we understand that, yes, we will be looking to work with proponents and with workers and create pathways and work with training institutions, but we need to do that in a sensitive way, recognising that for parts of our community, they'll experience a loss of what was, a loss of that history and a loss of that connection, and there's that time and that space that needs to be provided to create that new connection to the future and to the next iteration of our energy journey. And as always, we appreciate that kindness and some consideration and understanding of that is absolutely essential when working with communities in transition. I thought it's useful recognising that to unlock the opportunities in regional communities, particularly one like Gippsland, there's some really essential elements that need to occur, and they are, like I say, hyper place based. The first of these is to have really strong communication. We see it's a shared responsibility for those of us in place who are particularly invested in supporting investment, driving investment, seeing the regions grow, where our responsibility is to partner, to help, to provide guidance, and to make those connections to make things happen. But it is the responsibility of proponents coming in to be open to that communication and to be earnest in that communication, to understand that communicating clearly, repeatedly, helping lift the understanding of community in place and the understanding of industry. If industry is to pivot from one type of industry or energy generation to another type of energy generation, how is it that proponents are providing that information into the community? We've had some great examples of that in Gippsland, and I'll provide you with some access to a portal that'll let you look at some of those materials towards the end. Knowledge sharing, so understanding that proponents coming into the space generally hold a lot more technical knowledge and knowledge of things that have occurred in other places. And it's a really delicate balance around bringing the knowledge of other place, but then also acknowledging there's a need to build awareness and understanding in place as well. And those are two things that at time can create a bit of tension, but need some gentle guidance in terms of being able to navigate and provide insights that help communities on that journey. So important knowledge sharing, being able to bring technical experts into space to be able to have conversations which are really quite open with both business and industry, really exploring and stretching out all of the elements of those conversations. We often hear people talk about working with local champions, and I wanted to make the point that local champions, people who are pro projects and local leadership can at times be two very different things. And for small regional communities like the one that I work with, creating local champions and ignoring local leadership can sometimes lead to fracturing and division within communities. And that while it's easy to work with champions who are eager and enthusiastic partners, it is very important to make sure that we are creating the connections into local leadership. And that requires time and investment, certainly requires respect and an understanding of those leaders and the way in which they operate in those communities. I thought I might take a moment when we talk about leadership just to also give people some insights. One of the groups that we work with very closely in the Gippsland region are entities like the Regional Development Australia Gippsland Committee. I note that Regional Development Australia committees exist right throughout Australia. They are active participants in the energy transition. And so if you are working in a local area, I cannot more highly recommend that you connect with your RDA committee. If you're operating in Victoria, we have a mechanism called the Regional Partnerships. Again, another great mechanism that can provide support, certainly provide some feedback and some sage advice in terms of how to work best with communities. And then there's a range of other groups. But certainly if you are working with the state in those locations, they are often able to help talk to you about the stakeholders that will be useful to you in terms of being able to drive and generate support, communication, and that knowledge sharing. When we talk about engagement, I think it's a really useful point that there's project engagement and then there might be sector-wide engagement. And you will have noted from the previous slides that we have 10 project proponents in Gippsland for 12 feasibility licenses. We have a range of other energy projects occurring in the region as well. We've got private investment projects. We have government funded projects also occurring, and they are likewise connecting and contacting that very similar group of very small communities that live along the coast of Gippsland. And one of the things that we've indicated is truly important is for all of those projects, not just the 10 feasibility licence holders, but the private projects and the government projects to join up. Because what we have seen in certain circumstances is an energy project proponent turns up at a tiny community population, 300-400 on Monday, somebody else is there on the Wednesday, and then somebody else is there for the weekend. And we talk about the fact that you know, the heavy lifting there is being done by the community. And one of the things that we do in the region is try and kind of navigate the traffic, sort of air traffic control, as it were, the engagement coming in, so that communities have the best opportunity to participate in that engagement without it almost becoming full-time work for them. And certainly if I reflect in some of the early days, that was indeed some of the feedback we received from community members, which was, we are volunteers, community volunteers in this incredibly small community, and this is almost full-time work for us. And there is a need to recognise the power imbalance between working with volunteers and providing support to volunteers, and then professional organisations moving into the space, and the tempo that needs to be there to allow community to engage in a way which is meaningful and connected to the rhythm in which they operate as well. And we've talked about place-based. If I were to reflect on some of the best opportunities or some of the best examples of ways that we've seen of projects connecting with community and doing all of the things that we talk about here and developing support, it is when they utilise place-based resources. And we know that this isn't necessarily something that everybody can do, but we certainly make the recommendation, if you are working in regional communities, one of the best things people can do is connect to or look to secure members of the team that have that regional knowledge, that have that place knowledge, and who have an existing network and connections, because that is a really easy way to be able to move that project into the space where you're having meaningful conversations, as opposed to just starting to test the waters and create connections in community. So place-based is incredibly important. I'll just move on in terms of driving investment into the regions. It's a conversation that occurs often around social license. You know, how is it that the Gippsland offshore wind feasibility has received very strong support from sectors of the community, certainly very strong support from a range of governments, local governments, state governments, obviously it's federal government declaration, but then other associated bodies in the region. Part of that is about social license, and we see that it's tied to a range of things for our community. And I've kind of listed them as simply as I could here on this diagram. And so people often talk about if we're bringing an energy project, we're bringing jobs. And that is absolutely something people want to hear. And they want to hear about the direct employment jobs. They also want to hear about supply chain jobs. And particularly for our region, where we've got an existing supply chain that has been servicing brown coal-fired power generation, people are very eager to understand, how does that supply chain move to the renewable energy supply chain? We also are asked questions around local procurement. And I know that project proponents will often receive questions around local procurement. What are your requirements for local procurement? What are the types of targets we can expect to see? And so being prepared and ready for those conversations, absolutely important in terms of working with regional communities. Social procurement, something also incredibly valued, recognising that the renewable energy transition does provide a really unique opportunity to create a workforce that is potentially more diverse than others that we have had historically, and create opportunities for cohorts, potentially disadvantaged cohorts, or cohorts that have previously been locked out in employment for a range of employment is an element of this new energy transition that we are embracing. Community benefit, and I think this is a really important point to note, that for communities, they have a much more mature and deep understanding of community benefit than potentially there was, say, in the 80s and 90s when some of our power stations were operating. So communities no longer will be satisfied with football clubs being painted or some new bibs for the netball team. Communities are asking those tough questions now. What is the community benefit here that is generating long-term impact and benefit for the communities hosting this infrastructure? That's what they're looking for. Then we move into training and education pathways, because every resident in Gippsland with children wants to know, what is the pathways for not only future workers, but existing workforce needing to pivot or wanting to pivot to renewable energy. And then we talk about barriers to participation. So they are the simple, that's the simple diagrams, the simplest way I could put that diagram together just to provide some information around the way in which we've been supporting policy certainty to drive those investments is holding social license. That absolutely underpins where we're at. I'll just quickly leave you with just this insight. I thought I might give you just a bit of a very quick example of the experience from a resident. And I'm just going to quickly talk to you about Graham from Flynn, who lives with his wife, Julie. They've lived there for a very long time. He happens to have a range of easements through his property. And he's had connections from state-owned projects, private industry projects, and a number of transmission projects, all seeking to gain access through his property. And in his mind, these things are all the same. He doesn't necessarily see the distinction between state government, private entities, or other organisations that want to access his property. And so one of the things we've been talking about is, how do we make that easy for the landowners? Rather than, as he did on one particular day, he received 6 letters seeking access to his farm, and that was quite overwhelming. And so he has reached out and with some support from his neighbours, has negotiated that he creates days where people can come to his farm and have access if they want to do cultural heritage assessments, soil test or assessments to determine the possibility of projects moving through his land. And so one of the things that we remain connected to is what is the experience for those landowners, because they are incredibly important in terms of being able to hold the confidence of a community and understanding the experience of how in these energy projects land for individuals. I did promise that I would end by giving you some links to resources. So you'll find here at the Gippsland New Energy website, you'll see a range of things. You'll see some items and artefacts that have been created by state agencies, but you'll also see some of the work that offshore wind proponents have also completed. And these have been important documents in terms of supporting existing coal workers to transition to offshore wind, but also to showcase the types of supply chain opportunities that might exist from this new industry developing in our region as well. I'm happy to close there, Kayla, and take any questions if you like.
Thank you, Sara, for your insightful presentation. And there is no doubt that regional collaborations is essential to the success of Australia's energy transition. And here we have some questions for you. And in your presentation, you emphasize the importance of the communication and the understanding with coal communities. Could you share some specific communication strategies or frameworks that have proven effective in aligning all stakeholders throughout the energy transition projects?
Absolutely. So we've had a very strong campaign of trying to build community understanding through communication activities, and a range of things that we've developed is the Gippsland New Energy Conference. So that's been a conference that's operated now for 3 years. So the very first year was very much offshore wind energy 101. Now a range of offshore wind energy proponents support that conference. Year 2 got a little bit more sophisticated, and year 3 we're getting into some really detailed conversations. That conference started with an audience of about 350. This year, 800 people attending. Important components to that conference too, things like community information days for young people where schools come through, they have conversations around the energy transition, and things that just pique people's interests around electronic vehicle expo. So people can come in, look at electronic vehicles and just understand the changing nature of the energy transition. We've also had a range of activities in combination with Federation University. So we've had what we've described as the Innovation Breakfast Series. So every month there's a breakfast in the region which either talks to or leans to or is adjacent to the energy transition in some way. And so it has talked about things like participation for marginalised cohorts. It has looked at supply chain. In fact, there's one next week talking about geothermal energy. So, we're using a range of devices, but I think we have a cohort of people that come together which we call the Gippsland New Energy Coordination Group, made up of local government, state government, federal government, and our project proponents, where we have these conversations on a monthly basis. And absolutely front and centre for us is what more communication activity could we be doing?
Thank you, Sara. And as renewable energy continues to advance, how can we ensure that this progress aligns with the decommission of existing infrastructure, taking into account the continuity of local economies and the employment?
Absolutely. Ensuring the continuity of employment and opportunity is absolutely essential. And I think when Gippsland first started its energy journey, it was probably the predominant conversation we were having at the time, which was, what is the quantum of workers that will need to move from brown coal-fired power generation into other energy, if indeed that's what those workers choose to do. And we've had some tremendous leadership from a number of the existing coal-fired power stations that exist at the moment. And I will kind of just talk about the Yallourn example for a moment. So the Yallourn power station has given notification of its intention to close. It has had, really deliberately structured conversations with workers around, what their future journey will look like. They've got time to be able to invest in training and retraining. So if workers are seeking to move into renewable energy, they've got time to be able to craft a journey, curate a journey of development activities. But it might be that workers are either seeking to retire and then they've got time to craft what that looks like. But they might also be choosing completely new careers that sit outside of the energy space. And so I think, that's been a tremendous piece of work that has supported those conversations. But in all the communication work that we do, we are very mindful that people are really eager and interested to understand where the jobs are. And I will point out that when we're talking about renewable energy, particularly our offshore wind journey, when we talk about construction and operation and maintenance, we also need to be thinking about the supply chain. So it's a very significant supply chain that currently supports brown coal-fired power generation. And it's really important that we are working with that industry more broadly to understand where the pivot points are, which is why some of the documentation that's been produced by the proponents to date and some further work we are doing. So we do have a supply chain working group in the region where we have those conversations as we continue to unpack and understand where the value creation is in place.
Thank you, Sara, for your thoughtful response, and your emphasis on regional communities' role in facilitating the energy transition is invaluable. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
And
thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Matthew Dickie, APAC Head of Regulatory Affairs at RWE. Matthew will discuss essential lessons from global offshore wind projects to fast-track Australia's development, drawing from RWE's extensive experience in offshore wind projects worldwide. Hi, Matthew. The stage is yours.
Thanks, Kayla. And thanks to all the speakers that have gone before me. It's great to be on an energy panel where I think I'm going to be the only male speaking. It's we've come a long way. So thank you to Leader Associates too. I will just share some slides. You give me a second. Now, I hope people can see that okay. So as Kayla mentioned, RWE, we're a global developer of renewable projects, and specifically today I'm going to be focusing on offshore wind. And in that respect, RWE, we have 19 operating offshore wind farms, mostly in Europe. All in Europe, the operating ones. We've got a couple more under construction, and then a large portfolio globally that we're developing and hoping to get to FID and build in the coming years. And one of those projects is it's one of the ones that Sara mentioned in the Gippsland region. It's the Kent offshore wind farm. So I'm going to divide my presentation up into three parts. The first part is just looking at where is Australia at with its offshore wind journey. The second part is looking at the global context, and then the third part is looking at what does Australia need to do to sort of launch to that next level? So some people love this slide, some people hate this slide. You have to take this all with a grain of salt, but there is no doubt that there's a huge potential for offshore wind in Australia. You know, this work, which I think was done by GWEC and ORIAC, along with NOPSEMA, was looking at the technical potential for offshore wind, and they found that 5,000 gigawatts or 5 million megawatts of offshore wind was technically possible. Now, a lot of that, I think 2/3 of that is in deep water, which would be floating, which you know, at the moment is the more expensive version of offshore wind. There's also a significant portion of that along the northern coasts, which is sub 7 meters per second, which is, you know, probably not going to be economic for a long time at least. And there are huge parts of the country that are not close to load, huge parts of the country that are not close to grid. But I put the slide up just to make the point that Australia is clearly blessed with offshore wind resources. Now, one of the challenges for offshore wind, however, is Australia is a huge landmass, and it is much less populated than other parts of the world. And you can see there Japan on the right transposed next to the Australia map, and then Australia overlaid over Europe. I always like to show this to RWE as a German company, and when colleagues from head office visit and they want to go and visit our solar farm in southwest New South Wales from Melbourne, say, okay, do you want to hop on a flight from Germany to Greece, and we'll go there for the day. They are big distances in Australia, big areas. And given the sparse population, it does mean there is a lot of opportunity for onshore wind and PV. And I guess what that means is it puts the pressure on offshore wind. Offshore wind at the moment is more expensive. And so to get the industry off the ground, it does require some government support. Now, you may be thinking then, why do offshore in Australia, given the potential for onshore? The big reason, or one of the big reasons, is the grid. So Australia, you can see what a giant area it is, but the actual grid that has been built is relatively limited. It's hugging the east coast and through to Adelaide, and then as Wenona pointed out, you know, there's 3 grids in the west as well. But they are heavily localized, and they were traditionally built to service coal areas and then to link those coal regions with the major cities. And then lower voltage network has been used to send the electricity out to the regions. Now, it's those same regions that have the best onshore and solar, and so they require new grid. The existing low voltage network can't transport the electrons back to the cities from these regional areas. And so it's not just as easy as planting new onshore and solar around the country. It does, in most cases, need to be connected to grid. I know Wenona talked about off-grid opportunities, but predominantly most of the load is being serviced via grid. And for that reason, offshore does offer a good opportunity in certain areas, and it's particularly in those coal areas where the existing coal generators are closing or they're coming towards the end of their life, and that's going to open up a lot of new capacity on those lines, and you don't need to build new transmission. Those tend to be areas that are quite heavily populated, so not suitable for onshore wind or large amounts of solar, and so that offers the opportunity for offshore wind to connect in. And what I've just described, I guess it plays out when you look at the regions that have been declared by the federal government for offshore wind development. So you can't just go and develop offshore wind wherever you like in Australia. First of all, the Energy Minister at the federal level needs to declare the area, and they will first declare a draft area, seek public feedback, and then after digesting that feedback, they'll decide on the final area and then open it up for applications. And the Western Australian region and the Indian Ocean, that's currently going through a process. Gippsland has been declared and projects awarded. Hunter has been declared and the auction has been run. And I think for both Hunter and Southern Ocean, preliminary decisions have been made, but we're waiting for the final decisions. But you can see all of those areas chosen. They're close to the existing grid. And in particular, Gippsland and Hunter are also close to retiring coal fleets. Probably the Indian Ocean zone as well. So just to dive a little bit deeper on what Sara was talking about, this is the Gippsland awards that were made. So the dotted green areas show what was the area declared by the minister, and then proponents bid for particular areas, and the most meritorious projects, as decided by the minister and his team at the department, were these 12 projects. So all up, that's over 25 gigawatts of capacity. So it shows there's a lot of interest. These are a lot of the biggest offshore wind players in the world that have come to Australia that really see opportunity here. Gippsland, with its unique combination of strong wind, connection to existing grid, and close to this region that is undergoing something of an energy transition. This is just to point out what the existing regulatory framework is. I won't go through all the detail, but the point is that Australia has developed a pretty good framework for issuing licenses. Developers know where to target and where not to. There's an assessment of project and proponent viability. And so that ensures only the best projects sort of get through the starting gate and actually start their development in earnest. And then there's a tiebreaker system if equally meritorious projects overlap. And in that, those proponents can go and negotiate, try and resolve the overlap. If that doesn't resolve it, then there's a financial bid process, but that hasn't had to be used yet. So overall, there's a pretty good framework for deciding which developers should get the exclusivity to certain areas. Then looking at Australia's targets. So as far as decarbonisation targets go, the feds have led strongly, as have all the states. In fact, I think all the jurisdictions in Australia are aiming for net zero by 2050. Also federally, there's a target for 82% renewables by 2030. And when it comes to offshore, Victoria has definitely led so far of all the jurisdictions. And it's those targets that have previously been mentioned that Victoria has now legislated. I think it is unusual to have a subnational government which sort of sets the offshore wind targets and financially supports offshore wind. And I think from an industry perspective, we do hope to see federal support coming in down the track to ensure ongoing sustainable growth of the industry. And it's promising that there is already that strong, and I would say bipartisan ambition for decarbonisation. So the second part I wanted to discuss was where is the industry at globally? So Australia's ambition, as you can see, for 2030 is relatively small in comparison. That's no criticism of Victoria. As I said, I think Victoria's done, a real leadership role on offshore wind so far. But then if we look out further to targets, say 2040 to 2050, even though we've got that strong ambition from Victoria, we're still a long way behind a lot of these other markets. And that is important because as a market, Australia is competing with global investment dollars. And we are asking the supply chain excuse me, to move a long way south. And so Australia needs to stand out from the crowd. And right now on targets alone, it's not. And so I'll come to that a bit later about what I think Australia could do. So the global offshore wind industry, it has been facing some headwinds in the past year or two. There's been significant underdevelopment of the supply chain. And that's I'm just talking about supplying existing contracted projects, let alone servicing far-flung markets like Australia. On top of those supply chain impacts, there continue to be global inflationary impacts, and we've seen project costs go up in most parts of the world. So I guess nonetheless, while the fundamental need for offshore wind globally is, I would say, assured, Australia is not immune from these global issues. And that is a further reason which leads to what Australia needs to do to stand out from the crowd. So what Australia does need to do, I think, can be grouped under these 4 headings. So revenue stability, commitment, focus, and framework simplicity. Dealing with commitment first, what I'm talking about here is really long-term commitments of governments. It's not the sugar hits, as I call it. Like I have young kids. If I want them to go out and have a good day, I don't give them Cocoa Pops for breakfast. I might get a good hour out of them from the Cocoa Pops, but if I give them porridge or muesli or, I don't know, eggs or something like that, they are more likely to go out and have a good day for, the duration of the day. And it's the same thing with industry. Getting short-term commitments and, sort of this a one auction at a time, it doesn't give supply chains that long-term confidence to invest. And so what we really want to see is a plan for offshore that goes beyond the first 2 gigawatts. On revenue stability, just to dive a bit deeper, I mean, this is not just about handouts to developers. I think it's important that these financial stability mechanisms are sustainable for the governments that set them. And that the model that we are most familiar with that has worked well overseas is a 2-sided contract for difference. And that means that when energy prices are high, that offshore wind projects or whichever project has one of these contracts, they're actually paying money back to the government. And then when energy prices are low, the government is topping up these projects. And so they then get this stable revenue source that they can bank, and they can go out and build the project with confidence. Banks want to get behind it, equity partners want to get behind the project, but it's not about just handing money over and giving windfall profits. So it's very important that whatever mechanism is chosen, and I think we do support the 2-sided contract for difference model, that it is based on true project costs, and so having a competitive auction, and that it does have this this revenue sustainability, so that a one-sided contract for difference, for example, would see potentially windfall profits flowing to developers. A 2-sided CFD gives those excess profits back to government, and that makes the whole mechanism much more sustainable in the long term. Another key aspect on revenue stability is indexation, so that these inflationary risks, which we've seen being really pronounced over the last few years, that they are shared. The key point about this slide is that the more complicated you make a regulatory framework, the higher the barriers to entry will be. And then companies that are looking around the world at different markets, they're going to need to see big volume in the particular market to justify making an investment there. So bringing in simplicity in the frameworks just lowers the barriers to entry and will make Australia more attractive. I think while we do have a relatively unique licensing framework that I outlined on one of those previous slides, it is something that developers have been able to get their heads around relatively easily. It also didn't have high costs to entry. There were administrative costs to pay to cover the regulator and administrators' costs in running the auctions, but it was only in rare cases that we knew we'd move to financial bids. So that has been one real advantage of the Australian approach and why you've seen such interest in Gippsland, I think. So then coming to focus, this is really talking about supply chain growth. Supply chain growth is going to be critical to bring costs down, and that's critical to having a sustainable industry. Traditionally, you've seen government financial incentives go to these early projects, and then as the industry's matured, projects have become cheaper. Supply chain is growth, and it's driven down costs. And then we've been able to see government subsidies reduce and in some cases even disappear. So getting that supply chain growth is critical. And I think the way that you get that supply chain growth, the best way is really having those long-term commitments that I spoke about before. If you force high local content prematurely, paradoxically, that can actually restrict the supply chain growth as fewer projects can be brought to market at competitive prices. So instead, if you're setting long-term targets, setting long-term auction trajectories, the supply chain, the developers, they can all see that certainty and they will come in and invest. So just to sum up, Australia, we need to have entry barriers that are lower than those established markets. A lot of these markets have had more than 2 decades to establish interactions and routines. And given how far away Australia is, we need to go pretty hard, I think, to entice the supply chain down here and to get the growth. We need that far-sighted roadmap with revenue stabilisation, port and grid plans, and that going beyond the first 2 gigawatts. And then I think if we get that, the supply chain and the project developers will invest, and Australia will benefit from the jobs and investment and diversity of supply that offshore can bring. And that's all from me. Thanks, Kayla.
Thank you, Matthew, for your thought-provoking presentation. And the lessons drawn from global offshore wind projects will undoubtedly help Australia accelerate its offshore wind development. And here we have got some questions from our audience. In your presentation, you mentioned that the need for international supply chain support is important. Which country's supply chain strengths do you believe could provide the greatest assistance for offshore wind project development in Australia?
It's hard to pick a particular country. I mean, as a developer, we want competition, and so getting as many suppliers as possible into the market is best for us. It's going to drive down prices and lead to lower costs for consumers. So we'd like to see a really diverse supply chain. And I mean, ultimately, you want to have a local supply chain. Then, when you need to do maintenance or place a component, you've got the supply chain right there to do it. It's just a matter of how you get to getting that local supply chain and how you can let it grow organically. And I think that's where the setting the long-term targets and roadmaps it really help to provide that certainty for supply chain to come in and invest. But no particular favorite country. All are welcome, I think.
Thank you. Understood. And on a similar note, what can Australia learn from international best practice regarding cumulative environmental risk assessments for offshore wind projects?
Yeah, I think this is, one advantage for Australia in being a second tier mover in offshore wind. You can see with those projects just in Gippsland how many there are in a relatively small area, and it's not going to be efficient for each of the proponents there to do their own studies, and it's not going to be the best outcome for the environment either. So if you can get some pooled studies, some more ecosystem level studies done, you're going to get better outcomes both for the projects and lower cost outcomes, but also environmental outcomes, because you get more of a holistic view of all the environmental impacts that need to be taken into account.
Thank you, Matthew, for sharing these invaluable lessons from the global offshore wind sector. And we look forward to seeing how Australia can integrate these insights into its development strategy. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thanks.
And now, as we shift the focus from offshore wind to onshore wind, we are excited to hear from Ms. Catherine Brain, Director of Development at OX2. Catherine will share insights into OX2's strategic expansion in offshore wind projects in Australia. Hi, Catherine.
Hello.
Hi.
I will just share my screen and hope that I'm sharing the right one. I think that's working. Thank you very much. So OX2 is quite a new entrant into the Australian market, and we're a company that's really strong on sustainability and believe that by enabling utility scale renewable energy development, we accelerate the shift away from fossil fuels to a fossil-free environment. A little bit on OX2. So we have mostly operating through Europe. As you can see, we've got quite a strong presence in Europe. We're the largest renewable energy developer in Europe, and we also now have an Australian interest. We operate across the whole value chain, so from greenfields development to EPC to asset management. The only thing we don't do quite yet is invest in our projects. But quite recently, we've just been taken off the stock market as we've been acquired by EQT. So there is some appetite for, it looks like someone, sorry, there is some appetite for retention of some of our projects. So you can see we're predominantly a wind developer, and we also develop solar PV and BESS. So if you look at the countries that we're in, we established 20 years ago. We're headquartered in Stockholm in Sweden, and more recently other European countries and Australia have been added to the Swedish portfolio. Some markets we do more technologies than others, and in Australia we do all technologies apart from offshore wind. We've had a successful 15 years in our growth, and we've been pioneers in wind in Sweden, and our workforce has expanded from around 100 to 500 in the last 5 years. We're also the leading onshore wind developer in Europe. And this is part of our strategy in that we start early stage projects. We have various milestones and gateways to go through, as most developers do. But because we're involved across the whole value chain, we believe we have well-developed projects that are constructible, and that's the benefit of working across those areas. The timelines here obviously depend what state you're in and what technology, but it gives you an idea of the way we work. We're going to continue to sell projects at financial close, but we will retain some as well. Now, in Australia, we have entered Australia in May last year, where Ox2 acquired Esco Pacific, which was quite a leading solar and BESS developer across the NEM. And as part of that acquisition, also acquired a pipeline of solar and BESS projects. We have a development portfolio of over 3 gigawatts in Australia, and we manage over 400 megawatts of solar generation across the NEM. We're still focusing on the solar and BESS, but we also are adding wind to our portfolio. So we've been in the news recently, and it's been quite a busy year. So we have acquired our first wind farm, which is in Western Australia. And we have also closed 3 other projects this year. So 2 projects in Victoria and 1 project in New South Wales. The Victorian project has not been fully announced yet, but we'll be managing EPC and the asset once it's operational as well. The other 2 projects went straight to a sale at financial close and no involvement after that. So that was, I guess we do whatever works in the market. So our strategy is to keep through the whole pipeline, but if it works that we sell at financial close, that's fine too. So a bit about what's happening in Australia. So the challenge is so huge in Australia in that we need a 6-fold increase in generation from 21 gigawatts to 127 by 2050. And this graph really illustrates why solar and wind are good technologies to invest in. They're the cheapest. And this modelling also accounts for the extra transmission required to reach those technologies. Accompanied with that, we have coal retirement. And in the past, it's retired earlier than announced and earlier than expected. I can't see any reason why this trend won't continue, although it's obviously harder to manage, but it seems like, you know, less financial support is given to coal near the end of the life, and then things escalate. So it's a large capacity that needs to be replaced by renewable energy in Australia. What's interesting, even though solar PV has been around for a while, the price is still projected to go down. So dispatchable solar generation, I think for that reason, will play a large part in the Australian market. Solar is quicker to develop than wind, and it's a more predictable output. Similarly, BESS in Australia is also projected to go down in price over the next few years. So you could ask, why not just generate solar and BESS? It's the cheapest. Why not just do that in Australia? Why worry about other technologies? And I do think BESS is really important, supporting technology in the market. And dispatchable solar PV with BESS could produce energy at quite a low price. But I do think it's such a big challenge. If you look at the onshore wind trajectory, the prices are not going to drop by a huge amount, but the revenue capture is higher with wind. It can be a complementary output with solar. The time of day generation can be spread across areas in the market, and there is less impact on farming land than the solar PV. So it has a really good niche, and it's certainly sought after by investors in the market. I think it's really interesting. I added this slide because the demand is projected to increase, demand for generation in Australia, and I haven't seen a slide like this for around 16 years. So these were what the slides always seem to look like, where demand for electricity was increasing year on year on, until the GFC, the global financial crisis, 16 years ago, and then the demand just flatlined. There was less industry, the industry impacted by the GFC, but also the solar PV on rooftops. So it's really interesting now that there is also an increase in demand that's projected, and that's due to data centres, which are really hungry for energy, EV, and general electrification of the network. So to sum up, we need it all. It's important to have a diversified portfolio. There's different timeframes for development between wind, solar, BESS, different environmental and visual impacts. And in one region, it might be that the region quite likes wind farms and doesn't like solar, and vice versa in other regions. So social acceptance does differ from region to region and from technology to technology. And then, of course, your dispatch is much more varied if you have a few different technologies. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for sharing OX2's vision and the strategy for the onshore wind market in Australia. And we have a question for you. With OX2's 3 gigawatt pipeline, what are the key challenges and opportunities you anticipate?
So it's interesting. There's plenty of opportunities and plenty of challenges in renewable energy development. And if it were something easy to do, we'd all be doing it. But the opportunities are that there's a huge amount of interest in well-developed projects, and there's a lot of interest for PPAs. There's a lot of interest in investment, and there's the CIS and opportunities, policy opportunities like that renewable energy can benefit from. Challenges, though, is that and these are not new challenges. It just takes a long time, and it seems that especially in the biodiversity space, there seems to be sort of a difficulty in getting approvals, and it seems that just a little bit more here and a little bit more there, and you have to keep sort of adding and adding to your project to get it over the line, even though you've followed guidelines. So it is a tricky process getting through the EPBC process and state government approvals, and grids. Transmission's always an issue for renewable energy projects now. There are still really good land areas for projects, but as projects are being developed, of course, there's less sites available, and the sites available, there's always challenges on each site, and they're varied depending on where they are. But transmission's one of those large challenges as well, finding sites that are good sites near good transmission. But I think, so the speed to market is a challenge, but there's a lot of opportunities on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for sharing OX2's strategy and the vision for expanding onshore wind in Australia. And your insights into scaling projects and the strengthening local supply chains are crucial to the future of the sector. Thank you.
Thank you.
And as we come to end, I would like to thank all our speakers for their informative presentations and our audience for joining us today. We hope this session has given you valuable insights into the exciting developments happening in Australia's wind sector. And today's recording, along with a short recap, will be updated in the following days. If you have any comments, please feel free to drop me a message at the below contact. Before we close, I'd like to remind everyone about the Australia Wind Energy 2025, Australia's largest onshore and offshore wind energy gathering, where you can meet the entire wind energy value chain. It will take place on July 17th to 18th, 2025 in Melbourne. This is a key opportunity for industry stakeholders to exchange insights for valuable partnerships and close major deals. We hope to see you there. Thank you once again and have a good day. Bye.